So, good morning, good afternoon to everyone out there. I'm Chirag, and today I will be talking on dynamic layers in Yocto project. So, I am from TI, and TI we believe in upstream first mentalities, where we have been contributing to several open source projects uh, from past few decades, and we encourage everyone to use open source software. A brief introduction about myself. So I joined TI 2 years back as a college graduate. So till now, I'm primarily working on building custom embedded Linux distribution for TI's ARM-based Cetara microprocessors using the powerful Yocto project. So I'm currently maintaining the processor SDK releases for all our TI Cetara microprocessors. So, a brief overview about the presentation. So, I will be starting with the introduction on what are dynamic layers. Then we will see when to use dynamic layers. Moving on, we will see how to implement them along with the benefits. I will also show you some scenarios where dynamic layers may not be appropriate or beneficial, and in that case what are the alternatives to that, and finally we'll have a conclusion. So just a brief disclaimer, this is a technology presentation and not a product readiness or roadmap commitment, and the opinions presented here are that of mine and not TI. So with that, let's get started. So what are dynamic layers? So before jumping onto dynamic layers, I have something for you all. So I have a treat meal for everyone out here. So I have few main courses for you guys along with few desserts or side dishes, what we say. But along with that, I have a challenge for you guys. So I know you guys are hungry out there, so you will definitely consume the main course. But my challenge is someone out there who is ready to complete or consume side dishes along with the main course as well? And if yes, I will provide him or her a glass of wine. So yeah, moving back to the presentation. So if we replace the main course with our open embedded core and the side dishes or the dessert with uh, your with any popular distribution, then the condition which I added was if you are consuming open embedded core along with your favorite distribution, then I will provide you a feature, and that's what dynamic layer is. So dynamic layers are basically features which allows you to conditionally include recipes or configurations based on the presence of other layers. So the next time when you're working with Yocto and dynamic layer, just remember me and my treat challenge. So when to use dynamic layers? So following are some scenarios where you might want to use them. So firstly, as we saw, conditional dependency. So there might be cases when you want to include features if and only if a software component is present. For example, let's say you have a requirement where a customer is asking you to provide a Yocto based file system with Chromium browser, but that's just a one customer out there, and you can't include that Chromium bulky browser in all the default file system. So what you will do in that case, you will use dynamic layers, and what you will do is use dynamic layers and include the Chromium browser only when uh, the customer is having a meta browser in his or her BB layers configuration file. The second use case is when you are preferring modular development. So typically when you're working on large projects with multiple teams, dynamic layers allow each team to develop and maintain their own layers independently. The third thing is customization. So let's say if you need to create customized build for different customers or products, dynamic layers will let you add or remove specific components without altering the core build configuration. For example, let's say you have a customer requirement where they want you to include meta qt6. So what you will do is, let's say if the customer is including meta qt6, you can have a dynamic layer which will basically deploy all the qt6 related packages and stuff. But at the same time, let's say if other customers want to stick to meta qt5, you can have another set of dynamic layer in parallel which will deploy qt5 specific package when meta qt5 is included in the layers bb layers configuration file. There are few more scenarios like resource management, and by resource I mean the build system. And secondly, let's say if you are testing out any experimental features on configurations, instead of going and modifying uh, your recipes manually, you can prefer having a dynamic layer where you maintain all your testing related changes which are still not ready for production, so that you can basically easily plug and play it and uh, try out your basically generate your Yocto based file system. So how to implement dynamic layers? So briefly, I have divided into three steps. So step one would be first identify the list of changes you want to implement in your dynamic layer. Secondly, once you have your list of changes ready, just go ahead and update the BB files dynamic uh, in your specified or preferred distribution layer, in typically the layer.conf file, and just add an entry with the following syntax, which is collection name colon the file pattern. I will explain with an example later so that things are clear. And along with that, it's not compulsory, but it's better if you update layer recommends for that particular distribution with the equivalent collection name. And step three is eventually creating the dynamic layer in your layer, in your preferred layer, basically, and it should match with the file name pattern which you are providing in BB files dynamic. So how to implement dynamic layer? So let's think of an example where the use case is, let's say I want to build and install Chromium browser in my distro image, provided meta browser is enabled in my BB layers configuration. So as I mentioned, step one is to identify the list of changes. So the typical and the only change I want is to add the Chromium ozone variant to my desired image. So the list of changes are ready in my mind. So now I will go and update my BB files dynamic and have a collection layer. So typically I am naming it here as Chromium browser layer. And along with that, I am providing a file pattern, file name path, which is typically a combination of regular expression. And along with that, as I mentioned, it's not mandatory, but a good practice that we update the layer recommends to include the collection name as well. So I'm assuming here the distribution as meta-arago while I have this block of code in front of you guys. And now the step 3 is to actually implement that dynamic layer. So what I will do is basically create a dynamic layer which matches my file pattern name, which I mentioned in my layer.conf, and add the following content. And my goal was to just include the chromium ozone VLAN in my image. So in my image bb append file, what I will do is just include that, and that's it. And if I now bitbake the ti sdk default image with meta browser enabled in bblayers.conf, chromium ozone VLAN will be built and deployed in my rootfs. So it was that simple. Now moving on to the benefits of using dynamic layers. So firstly, with dynamic layers we can reduce build time. So taking chromium as an example, takes typically chromium being bulky, it takes a lot of build time, and you might not prefer it adding by default in your uh, file system. So what you can do is implement it via dynamic layer, due to which you can streamline the build process and which can lead to faster build times. Second is scalability. So let's say as your project grows, dynamic layers will make it easy to scale your build environment. You can just add a new feature or a support for a new hardware platforms without distributing the existing configuration. So typically use cases where you want a particular feature to go on a particular hardware, you can implement it via dynamic layers. Third thing is customization. So with dynamic layers, they enable great customization of the build process. So basically, you can tailor the build environment to specific needs or hardwares, as I mentioned, without modifying the core layers. And lastly, the dependency management. So dynamic layers typically help in managing dependencies between the layers. So you can ensure that certain layers are only included if their dependencies are met, which reduce the risk of build errors. So, so now I have some examples where dynamic layers are being used in the Yocto project community. So the first image which I have is of meta-arago, where if you see Chromium browser layer and SC Linux are being implemented as a dynamic layer. The image onto my right is of meta-raspberrypi, and if you can see, there are a bunch of features which are implemented by dynamic layers. And lastly, we have the meta-AWS below, where typically it's implementing to change a cloud init configuration file for a particular platform. So now we saw that where dynamic layers can be useful in your project, but let's see some use cases where dynamic layers might not be that useful. So the first case is for simple projects. So let's say for small or straightforward projects, the overhead of maintaining dynamic layers might outweigh the benefits. So in such cases, sticking to static layers can be simple and more efficient. Secondly, in case of stable environments, so let's say if your build environment is stable and the in your meta layers are rarely changing, the flexibility of dynamic layers might not be necessary, and again sticking to static layers can be more easier to maintain. Thirdly is the performance overhead. So the process of evaluating dynamic layers or including the layers can introduce a performance overhead during the build process, because eventually bitbake has to pass them. So in case of projects where the build time is crucial, this might be a drawback where you are implementing, let's say, a bunch of dynamic layers in your distribution. Next is the complex dependency management. So in some cases, managing the dependencies and conditions for dynamic layers can be complex and error prone. So this can lead to basically build issues if we are not handling dynamic layers carefully. Lastly, the learning curve inward. So for teams which are new to Yocto or with limited experience, the additional complexity of dynamic layers increases the learning curve, and it will eventually make the build system harder to understand and manage. So what should we do in such cases? So the alternatives for dynamic layers, as we already saw, firstly is the static layers. So using static layers can be simplify basically the dependency management and reduce the complexity. So this approach will ensure that all the necessary layers are included from start, and it will eventually avoid the conditional logic that dynamic layers bring in. Secondly, implementing conditional logic within the recipes themselves rather than basically across the layers can help managing variations without the need of dynamic layers. So basically, you can have the conditional statement uh, wherein you will deploy some of the features for a specific hardware. So basically, this approach keeps the build process more straightforward and easier to debug. And lastly, layer prioritization. So setting clear priorities for each layer can help manage dependencies more effectively. So what's the conclusion here? So I would say, based on your project needs, decide whether dynamic layers is really beneficial for you, or sticking with straightforward approach is better suited. I have attached few references which were helpful for me to build the slides. Finally, I thank the Yocto Project, the Linux Foundation, and Texas Instruments for providing me this opportunity. And lastly, you can reach out to me on my mail and LinkedIn. And finally, I'm open to Q&A.
Okay, thank you for your talk. We'll have like 10 minutes for questions. So plenty of time to ask your questions either in chat or on the microphone. We got a question in the chat. Is there a way to use dynamic layers but include stuff only in a case more than one layer is present in the layer collection? Do you see the questions in the chat? He's muted. You're muted, Chirag.
Yeah, sorry, I was on mute.
That's okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So is there a way to use dynamic layers but include stuff only in case more than one layer is present in the layer collection? Yeah, we can do that. So I've added, I guess I have included that in my references. So, but I will include few reference in the chat as well, with which you can implement that. Yeah. Second question is, in your example, I didn't see the dependency of meta browser layer. How do you specify it? Yeah, so eventually, if you see, I'm including that as a layer recommends, and not, it's not a direct dependency, and that's basically what dynamic layers are. So eventually there won't be a hard dependency, but what I'm ensuring is in my bblayers.conf, when dynamic when basically meta browser is included, then and only then my dynamic layer will get executed. But yeah, as already someone mentioned, yeah, it is recommended and not a direct dependency. Is it possible to alter distro or machine config within? Okay. I haven't tried that, but is it possible to alter, destroy, or machine config within dynamic layers? Yeah, Mathis, I haven't tried that. So, yeah, not sure. Is it possible to have two different versions of a package where one is chosen at runtime? I believe, yeah, we can do that, but it will eventually depend on uh, how you want to have your dependency chosen at runtime. So, is it basically dependent on a layer or stuff? So, Marty, if you can basically confirm. So let's say for Chromium as well, right? What we can do is under dynamic layers, eventually have, let's say, multiple BB appends, and what I can do is have a Chromium version, let's say 111 included for a specific machine, or for a specific hardware, and let's say a different uh, version for another hardware. But again, for doing that, what I will have to do is tweak my image install to basically add a condition for, let's say, a machine. But yeah, it's possible. And yeah, as mentioned in chat, we can use preferred version. Yeah.